Hi, boys and girls. This is Grandma Sheila. We're not having just one story, but three stories. The last story is called Freely Give. The first two stories are from the Bible because oftentimes boys and girls, they think that only miracles happen long time ago. I want to tell you a story that happened in the Old Testament, which is a long time ago, but also a story that happened in the New Testament when Jesus was here. And last of all, the story Freely Give happened just recently. God is still doing miracles. Well, first of all, we have the story of Elijah. He was a prophet of God. One day, God came to Elijah with a message. And this is what he said. You need to go to the court of the king. Well, King Ahab was a wicked king, and his wife was even wickeder. She had persuaded Ahab to not believe in the God of heaven, but to believe in her idols called Baal, and Ahab was a weak man. He did what she said. When God came to Elijah to tell him to go see the king, things were really bad in the kingdom. When he got to the court of the king, he walked right in. Well, you're not supposed to do that, but that's what he did. He walked right into the court. He stood in front of the shocked king and all the other people there in the court, and he said, "The God of heaven says there will be no dew, no rain for these years until you acknowledge the God of heaven as the only God." And then he walked away. Ahab was mad. He didn't even have a chance to say anything to Elijah. He just left. God was going to take care of Elijah because Jezebel, the queen, she said, "Well, go find him, arrest him. He can't talk to you like that." Ahab tried to find him, but God had taken care of him. Might of fact, he had sent him way far away from Samaria to a place of a little brook, and it was really protected. It was like in a tiny little valley between mountains and the little brook. Well, when Elijah got there, he knew he needed to stay there. He knew the king would be after him. He looked around, and yes, there was water in the brook, so he had water to drink. And then he remembered God had said that his bread and his water would be sure. Well, when mealtime came, here came some big black ravens flying in. And Elijah thought, I wonder what the ravens wanted. No, he didn't wonder because he knew that God was going to take care of him. And as the ravens flew over, they dropped big hunks of food. God was so good to him. And all the time that the water still ran in that brook, God sent the ravens twice every day with food for him. One day, the brook started to dry up. There wasn't even enough water to make the dirt damp. But Elijah trusted God. And sure enough, God sent another message. And he said, go to Zarephath. There is a widow woman there, and I have prepared her to take care of you. Elijah set off just as quickly as he could. And when he got there, he thought, I'm sure there's a lot of widows here. He didn't have a name. But then he saw a young woman out gathering sticks. And he thought, this must be the widow that I'm supposed to go to. And he called out to her, I am thirsty. Would you get me some water? And she graciously smiled and went to gather him a little bit of water. And she brought it to him. And as she was coming, he said, and by the way, would you make me a little cake? I'm hungry. Well, now, the woman didn't smile as broadly, although she lived in a heathen country. She believed in the God of heaven, and she knew that was the right thing to do. The reason she didn't just rush in to do that was because she knew that those few sticks that she was gathering to make a little fire were to cook the very last food she had in her house, a tiny little bit of flour and a little bit of oil. And she was going to make the last of it into something for her little son and her to eat. But she thought, no, I need to do what God said. So she invited Elijah to come in her house, and she started to prepare that little cake. That was all that was left. She had scraped out of the bottom of her little flour container all the flour that was there, and she let the cruse of oil drip, 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 till there was nothing left. Well, then her little son came in, and he could smell that little cake cooking, and he said, Mama, is that my lunch? And Mama said, this is a little cake for the prophet that's come to visit us. And he said, but Mama, I'm hungry. And she said, I know. Well, Elijah said, don't worry. God has promised that your barrel of meal and your cruse of oil will never go dry till after this drought has ended. She brought that cake to Elijah, and she went back, and her son said, Mama, Mama, look. And he took her over to where that flour container was and where that cruse of oil was that had been empty just a few minutes before. And they weren't empty anymore. Little boy said, I thought you said they were empty, Mama. And she said, God is providing for us. Well, Elijah was safe there with that widow lady. And every day there was always meal and there was always oil. What a miracle that was. Not only had Elijah been fed by the ravens, but God had provided for the widow because she had been kind enough to take care of Elijah. Finally, the message came to Elijah to go find the king. Well, the king had been looking everywhere for Elijah, and nobody could find him. He did find Elijah this time because God wanted him to be found. Ahab, he looked at Elijah and said, are you who troubleth Israel? Elijah said, it's not me that troubles Israel, it's you. You're not obeying God. You're worshiping idols when you've been told not to. God has said that there's to be a contest up on Mount Carmel. Your job, Ahab, is to gather all the people of Israel together at Mount Carmel. And he gave the date when it was supposed to happen. It had already been 3 years since the last rainfall. Well, Ahab, he listened and he set off to gather the people. When the day came, Elijah made his way up Mount Carmel, and all those people followed. And he had said, bring the priests of Baal. Elijah wanted to make sure this was a fair contest. And he told those priests, he said, you can go first. You build yourself an altar he gave him an animal that they killed to put on for the sacrifice. And he said, "You call upon your gods first. And the rules are that you cannot put any fire under your sacrifice. Your God has to rain fire down from heaven on it." They believed in their God. They started dancing around their idol. Around and around they went. And they were praying and calling to Baal to send down fire to show he was the true God. All morning they did that. By afternoon, they were screaming and hollering and running round and round that altar. By later in the afternoon, they had taken out knives and they were cutting themselves. Finally, when it was almost sunset, Elijah said, "It's enough. Stop. Baal has had his chance." And he looked at the people. He said, "Baal didn't do anything, did he?" Well, then he went over to the place where years before there had been an altar to the true God. And he started cleaning it up and hoisting, oh, that was hard work, those big stones, 12 of them up to make an altar to the God of heaven. And he put wood on top of it, and he put his sacrifice on top of it. And then he took a shovel and he dug all the way around it, a ditch. Everybody wondered, what's the ditch for? He turned to some of those people that were standing there and he said, "Take these 4 barrels, not little buckets, but barrels. Go down just beyond Carmel. Down in the valley, there was a sea. It had salt water in it, but that didn't matter." They went and they brought those barrels up. And he said, "Now I want you to pour it over the sacrifice, over the altar, and down into that trough." Well, they poured those 4 barrels, but 3 times Elijah said, "It's not enough water." And they brought more till they had brought 12 barrels of water. And they poured it over this. The trough was clear full of water. The wood under the sacrifice was soaked. The sacrifice itself was soaked. Now, can you start a fire in water? No. And Elijah knew that. Then Elijah put up his hands and he started to talk to God. You know, the God of heaven was Elijah's friend. And he said, "Oh God, please send fire down on this altar, on this sacrifice. Show the people of Israel that you are the one true God." And you know, as he was saying that, fire flashed down from heaven on top of that altar. And the Bible says that it burnt up the sacrifice, it burnt up the wood, it burnt up the stones of the altar, and it licked up all the water and all the dust that was around it. And the people of Israel stood there, their eyes were big. The God of heaven, he's the God. The God of heaven, he's the God, they said. And they were right. And they fell on their faces before God. And they repented of their sins. They believed that God was the true God. God had promised if they would repent from their sins, he would send rain. So Elijah went off by himself to pray to God to send the rain. He had to do that several times, but I think that was to give the people time to think about God. And then he saw a little cloud, and he ran to King Ahab and he said, "Get in your chariot, get your horses. It's going to rain and you'll be stuck in the mud if you don't go quick." So Elijah started to run in front of that chariot, and he ran on the strength of God all the way down that mountain, all the way back to Samaria, to the palace. He and Ahab were both soaked when they got there, but Ahab was so excited about what he had seen and what he had heard that he rushed in to tell his wife Jezebel. And he said, "You should have seen it. You should have seen it, Jezebel. It was marvelous." And then he told about how what had happened with the priests of Baal. They couldn't make any fire come down from heaven, and how the God of heaven had sent fire and all the things that he had done. And he just talked literally split. And then he said, and Elijah had told us to kill all the priests of Baal that were teaching the bad things to the people that weren't true. And we did it. And oh, Jezebel got so mad and she started to screech, "How dare you! How dare you kill my prophets! Now you go tell Elijah that by this time tomorrow he'll be dead." They sent a messenger out to tell Elijah. After all that running and all the excitement of the day, he was asleep. And when the message came to him, he was so tired that he ran away from Jezebel. But God was still watching after him. And we don't have time for that story. But look at all that God did for him. And in the New Testament, which is closer to our time, when Jesus was here, there was one day that he had decided to go up in the hills and he was going to talk to the people. Well, as he went through village after village, the people just followed him until there was a huge crowd. And when they got to the place where Jesus wanted to preach, it was lunchtime. And Jesus said to his disciples, "Have all the people sit down and we'll feed them." And the disciples went, "But we don't have any food, Jesus. And there's thousands and thousands of people out there. What are we going to do?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down in little groups." Well, then one of the disciples came to Jesus and he said there was a little boy who had 5 little tiny loaves of bread, kind of like little buns, 5 of them, and 2 little fishes. What could that do for thousands of people? But with Jesus, nothing's impossible. After the people were seated, and that little boy had willingly shared his lunch with Jesus, Jesus raised his hands to heaven and he talked to his Father, asking him to bless this food and make enough. And then he told the disciples to come. And they had some baskets. And Jesus, after he said the blessing on those 5 little loaves and 2 fishes, he started to break them in pieces. He put some in each basket. He kept breaking, put some more in the baskets. He kept breaking and breaking and breaking till all of those baskets were full. And every time they got a basket that was full, the disciples went out to one group of people and gave them that to eat. You know, that kept happening until everybody had eaten. And Jesus said, "Don't waste one crumb of it." And after the disciples had gone up and gathered what was left, after those thousands of people had eaten, there were 12 baskets of food left. Now that's a miracle. Now for today's story, the story called Freely Give. Over in the country of Asia, there were two young missionaries, Abel and Vale. They lived in a tiny little place that they had rented, and they lived way, way, way up in the mountains. Well, being so far up in the mountains, there weren't any stores. And yes, most of the people there in the village, they ate their rice that they grew, and they ate sweet potatoes and things they grew in their gardens. But sometimes there wasn't enough of that to last a whole year. But the boys, that Abel and Vale, they were student missionaries, and they had brought food up there in the mountains with them to eat, but you can only carry so much. And their schedule for them to leave was not for another week or so. And then they could go down and get more supplies. But right now, it was pretty tight. Well, Abel was sitting at the table assessing what they were going to have to eat. And Vale came in from the bedroom, and he said, "Abel, what's for breakfast?" Abel said, "Not much." And he got out. He got out their container of rice. And he said, "We have about 5 cups of rice to last you and I for at least another week and a half or maybe 2 weeks. And we have two sweet potatoes, and they weren't very big." Can you imagine if that's all you had to eat? It was better than nothing. Well, they were getting kind of weak from not having nearly enough to eat. So they weren't doing as much mission work as they had been doing before, because they had to keep what little strength they had left to be able to walk down the mountain, which was miles and miles, to get to the market. They were so tired that they decided to wait till another meal so maybe they could have more. Well, while they were getting ready to go lay down again, there was a at the door. Now, in their country, instead of knocking on the door like we do or pushing the doorbell, because they didn't have any doorbells and some of their houses didn't even have doors, but they would stand politely outside if they wanted to talk to the people inside, and they would cover their mouth and they would cough politely. Well, Vale and Abel, they heard that man coughing, so they went to the door and they said, "Can we help you?" And the poor little old man, he looked at them and he said, "Please, can you help me? Please. My son, my son hasn't had anything to eat for about 3 days. He's going to die. Could you give me some food for my son?" Well, Abel looked at Vale. This had to be a unanimous decision. And Vale said, "Why not? God, in His Word, has promised that our bread and water will be sure. He's kept us till now." So Abel went into act on that. He got out that rice container and he got out a measuring cup and he started to measure out rice. He measured out 2 full measuring cups of rice. And he put it in a little container he had. And he went back to the door. He politely looked at the man and said, "Take this to your son. I hope it helps." And the man went, "God bless you. God bless you." And he hurried away with that 2 little cups of rice. Well, Vale and Abel looked at each other and said, "Let's go lay down again." So that was what they did. When Abel woke up, it was almost dark outside. And he thought, "I better go cook some supper." He went in their little kitchen and he opened the container of rice. And he went, "Vale, Vale, come here, come here." And Vale got up and came running. He didn't know what was going on. He said, "What is it, Abel?" He said, "Look, didn't we give that little old man 2 cups of rice before we went to sleep?" Vale said, "Yes, we did." He said, "Look, look at the rice container." And boys and girls, that rice container was no longer just partially full. There were 10 cups of rice in there. The boys measured them out because they had to know how much this was. 10 cups of rice that would last them definitely till they could go down the mountain. And Vale, he looked at that and he said, "God's kept His promise. Our bread and our water are sure. He's amazing. He doubled what we had before we gave. I'm so glad that we chose to share." Boys and girls, the Bible and history and even current day, the story about freely giving just happened recently. Our God has not forgotten about us. Thank you so much for listening, boys and girls, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye now.